All right. Well, this is my last lecture of the year because Friday we're gonna do a little lab. We'll do a little lab. My little lab assistant this year did not have time most of the semester till the last day, so I mentioned to him that attendance will be kind of like but it'll be easy, and we're gonna look at. Well, we're going to look at real estate, we're going to look at properties, and we're going to look at incomes, we're going to look at redlining, we're going to look at the history of segregation in the Twin Cities, and basically just with maps and be able to pull up some things, see what we could deduce. But that will be Friday, which continues to be extra credit for people who want to come in, get some 10 points. Any general questions about anything before I finish up our last chapter? Laura? Traditionally this classroom is always one of the warmer because we're in an attic, but I don't know why this semester it's just been, I think freezing in here, but maybe I'm getting old. So sorry about it if it's freezing. So this chapter, well, it's in a unit on development, so it's kind of rounding that out, and it's kind of pointing at the future a bit, right? The future of development, both economically and otherwise. A number of the economic terms that start out this chapter, and a number of these terms that I'm sure you've noticed in this chapter, are mostly terms that we've used before, and so this chapter probably was a pretty light read for everybody. So things that are going on in the economy, things that countries do to economically develop. Well, many countries will find through time that they've had a comparative advantage. What does that mean? Well, these days, it's usually components of things that are made in different countries, and then there might be an assembly plant that is within a country or near a country where everything is brought together. But most things are made internationally by lots of different, and the reason we're able to do this is because of just-in-time production, right? We're timing all those parts of everything you want to make, being all finished and ready to be assembled at the same time. And this takes a lot of coordination. But this is also one of the factors of why during the pandemic it was so bad economically for so many places, is because you would have random countries that would maybe have a COVID surge. Some countries had really strong lockdowns compared to others, and so there was just lots of ups and downs. It feels like now those things are being ironed out, but in lots of ways it's going to still be different because countries have found alternative sources. China, that used to be a big supplier for lots of things, a lot of countries found out other suppliers for things, and it worked economically, and so a lot of them aren't going back to these old relationships. Well, if they can, they try to be, their economies try to be complementary with other countries. Mutual trade that exists between two places based on the supply of raw materials and demand for finished products or services, right? So if obviously different countries in the world have different raw materials, right? You could think of something as the classic case of fossil fuels, right? You could have a country that has lots of fossil fuels, and it's like, well, where does it fit in your economic product? Well, plastic is basically oil, right? And so if your thing you're selling is going to have some amount of plastic, you'll need to have access to those countries, right? Now, of course, a lot of countries have felt that in these relationships they get a bit stuck, right? Especially if, for example, they're creating a raw product where the people producing that product don't make a lot of money, right? I would say increasingly as we're looking to the future, things like lithium mines, right? They're making lots of money, but the actual people who do the mining and whatnot, they don't make a lot of money, and so that's not a real good way to kind of grow your middle class, which most countries, if they want to develop, they want to move up that chain of development, they want to have a large middle class that is able to just buy all the conveniences of life, right? Another term in this chapter, neoliberalism, which very often people just see that term and they think it's just, well, it's like if you're on the left or the right in the political spectrum, but it's not. Neoliberalism, it's liberalism in kind of how the Europeans use the term, and kind of a laissez-faire, well, as it says, belief in free markets, and that free markets should make all decisions when it comes to these things. And basically that neoliberalism says that the state should not be involved in economic decisions, should not be involved in economic development. The state should set aside. Of course, many countries have different arguments about this, right? There's lots of countries that feel that, well, the state should be active in regulating, the state should be active in monitoring the markets, making sure that nothing illegal is going on, right? And then there's plenty of states that are activist. Sometimes they're called managerial states. Japan is a good example of it. It's a very developed economy, a very good flourishing democracy, but they have a strong belief that the government should monitor business and make sure that it's basically maximizing its productivity and maximizing its benefits to its employees and the rest of the country, right? And like I said, there's different amounts of this in different countries, kind of depending on often the political winds of the time. Do a poll. Like I said, a lot of the stuff that we've actually talked about before, like supranational organizations, there's a feeling that in the future these organizations are going to have more and more of an emphasis on how business is done, and these organizations do things pretty differently. So the World Trade Organization, for example, very neoliberal in that they have a strong belief in open markets and free trade, where you have the European Union. They are a bit more interested in fair trade. They're more interested in basically every economic trade relationship being win-win, not just for the companies involved, but for the population and the greater public, right? And these things can often be in conflict with one another, right? IMF, like I said, we've talked about these organizations before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating stuff I've already said, but the IMF also a big believer in free trade, but less of an activist organization toward that end, right? And I would say the IMF has gone through changes through time. They used to be much more neoliberal, but now they've kind of scaled that back a bit. Another term that comes up in this chapter that we've talked about before, deindustrialization. I would say in general, well, this book, it has a publication date of 2024, but of course, you know, the data in it has to be from before 2024 because y'all have it now. In a nutshell, there were a lot of industrial cities that were part of the big industrial revolution, and there's a legacy to that in that a lot of those areas are still economic cores of the different countries, even if they're doing less industry. And although, yes, the US has come back as far as manufacturing and industrialization goes, really in just the past couple of years, but it's a pretty different type of industrialization. It tends to be cleaner, it's less centrally located, it's more like industrial parks that will be out in a suburb here and there, it's more like that. It's also tends to be much smaller scale, so if you picture, you know, someone with a 3D printer, right? It's like, well, technically that's manufacturing, but it's not connected to all the kind of problems that there were with industrialization before. And looking into the future, that's how basically the world is going to be going. There'll be more deindustrialization in that classic manufacturing. We'll probably keep on losing work, especially as more and more work gets automated. Robots and artificial intelligence, they're only getting more involved with your economy and not less, right? And so then the question is, well, then what will people be doing who used to be in those jobs? Well, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was first put in, that was the big worry. I think it was Ross Perot who was running for president in 1992, and he said that there would be a giant sucking noise from the south of jobs going to Mexico. And there was, it wasn't a giant amount, but it was an amount. And the Clinton administration invested in reskilling and people who lost work because industry left. They're like, you know what, we'll pay for you to go to school, maybe change careers, do something different, innovate. And although that took a while, unemployment went up, because it takes a while for people to go back to college and stuff. But there'll likely be even more of that. People going back to school often get updated in latest technology and whatnot. As these classic, you could call them traditional industry jobs, will continue to go away. I'm trying to remember. Well, that's right. This map here is showing you, well, I cut off the bottom. All right, let's see if I can get the bottom to be viewed. No? This one not show the bottom? All right, the bottom has a blue square, economic acceleration. Oh, now it works. What that means is, well, as you know, this chapter has a section on the Great Recession. Showed you a video about it. But in a nutshell, there are areas that were not as strongly affected by the Great Recession. And these tended to be economies that were less developed, and just financial services were not a big part of their economy, right? And increasingly financial services, as complex as they are, that's going to be a larger and larger part of the economy of the world. That's why you see so much about Bitcoin and whatnot. It's about moving money around. Well, I mentioned before, after the Great Recession, there was a big push to regulate the banking industry. There had been a lot of regulations after the Great Depression that regulated the banking industry, but those were scaled back, especially in the 90s. But as those were scaled back, what that meant is people could take riskier and riskier bets with money. And to the point that there's a lot of speculative investment, and it was in property at the time. It was in properties, and they were often in what later became known as predatory loans. Well, they were known as that at the time as well. But what that meant was a lot of loans that were designed basically to fail, that they had adjustable interest rates. So if you're getting a credit card or anything, check and see if it has an adjustable interest rate. Part of the reason why Wells Fargo is based out of the Dakotas is they have laws that allow them to change rates on credit. And so you could think you have a good rate, maybe interest rate of 3% or something, but they can just decide after some amount of time to change it to up to, I think, 27%. So check your rates and check if your card is adjustable, because it will just adjust. Well, like I said, these regulations have their ups and downs. In general, neoliberal politicians think there should be less regulations overall. They feel like regulations are inefficient, but the lesson of the Great Depression is you need some amount of basically safety guardrails in your economy, right? You can't allow people to make wildly speculative investments that could put you into a Great Depression or the Great Recession. One of the other things that a lot of countries have been doing to try to develop and encourage development, especially high-tech development, are what's called growth poles. These will be basically, you'll find a local cluster of your economy that is doing well. Like locally, I would say the biggest cluster is biomedical, especially biomedical devices. And it's no coincidence, it's because the Mayo Clinic is near and all that. Well, that much local knowledge and that much basically infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, that's considered to be a local advantage, right? And so encouraging the investment in that area locally through tax breaks or infrastructure incentives and things like this, tend to stimulate your economy in a way that is specifically geographic. We'll call it that, specifically geographic. Actually, I don't want to talk about that one. All right, changes in the economic landscape. We talked about just-in-time delivery a little bit, but that's the reason why something like the warehouse district in downtown, well, it's all changed into condos because we don't need to store a bunch of parts for things. Things will arrive just in time for assembly. Our economy has switched from Fordism to post-Fordism. What does that mean? Well, some of the main things about Fordism, well, a lot of infrastructure, right? If you think of industry and, well, the manufacture of automobiles being the classic case, but Fordism represents manufacturing, especially old school manufacturing in general. But with that also includes people being paid good wages and being able to be middle class and consuming a lot of things, which also creates a good and stable economy, right? Post-Fordism, focus on small batch production, right? No more of these giant complexes to make things. And also Fordism, well, highly standardized, right? Ford was famous in saying that people can have the Model T in whatever color they want as long as it's black, because that's all he had and that's all he was selling, because that was what he had bought in bulk, right? Fordism, the time period, everything was in bulk, but it also meant uniformity. It wasn't a lot of differentiation in products. Post-Fordism, that leans toward more diversity in products, right? Higher and higher specialized markets. I would say an example of post-Fordism would be like the purse industry in Italy, right? You could have a cluster of people who are designers, who are innovators, who are making lots of different types of purses. So rather than like everyone has one type of purse, they make it in a giant factory. Instead of that, you have specialty. Some people are making this type, people are making that type. People move around from industry to industry. Some people start up new branches of these industries like all the time, and then sometimes they just go out of business, or sometimes they do well. A lot of flexibility. That's the main thing about post-Fordism, is a lot of flexibility, aided by the fact that we will have computers to help us figure things out, basically. So major industrial regions of North America in general, this is probably somewhat similar to what you might think. Of course, the oldest traditional cluster was this whole area here for the large scale industry. And then through time, an amount of this began to kind of move around, including all the way over to California. Part of the reason industry was able to move over to California was because there was a lot of military investment that specifically went to California for a number of reasons, but one of which being California is a big state and it has lots of votes, and so politically it was expedient to maneuver money in that direction. Deindustrialization didn't just happen here, happened in Europe as well. Very large areas that had huge amounts of industry, giant large-scale manufacturing. Their decline was, well, it was a bit slower at first, and then it was rapid in the kind of catch-up phase, right? And it was the same thing that happened to North America, where manufacturing was increasingly automated, and also jobs for manufacturing were cheaper overseas, so those jobs just went away. Similar to the US, this area of Europe, they had to, well, clean up industrial sites, and they were largely successful in lots of different places where they're able to clean up and change industrial sites into residential. And then you had technological investment also in growth poles, similar to what we saw in North America. Deindustrialization, again, if you see the classic area that had deindustrialization, I would say the areas that were kind of on the fringes, which include here, they were areas that had more going on in their economies, and so they were able to pivot a bit better. but the real kind of core, that area still has a lot of kind of industrial landscapes that have not been changed over, not been renewed. They would still like to. It's still a process that is ongoing, but it's taking longer, right? So even though we talk about outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and manufacturing on the decline, there's still a lot of actual manufacturing happening in Europe and in North America. So don't get me wrong, it's not like we don't do any of it. It's just a lot less than it was. Partially, well, I've talked about this before, especially after the end of the Second World War. The world, much of it was blown up, and they had lots of need for products, and the U.S. was one of the only places that was still making stuff, and we still have a legacy of all that manufacturing. So a couple of these things I've talked about before: offshore, outsourcing, again, sending those jobs to other countries. Through time, people kind of noticed a bit of a division of labor. A little map here in that part of the chapter talking about how basically there was a global north and a global south. Many countries in the global south felt that they had been stuck, basically providing raw materials for manufactured goods, but not manufacturing on their own. But this map is older, and that has changed a lot as we have a number of countries that have come into the core, we could call it, similar to, well, we've talked about the core versus periphery before, but I would say with smaller scale manufacturing, smaller and smaller countries have been able to actually get into the manufacturing that couldn't before. So when it comes to the International Division of Labor, that's basically a thing that less developed countries didn't want to be stuck in the lower levels of that, and quite a few still feel like they are. Multiplier effects, economic effect in which a change creates large change, such as when a new manufacturing plant grows the economy by giving rise to more related jobs and services. Multiplier effects is one of the reasons why countries create special economic zones. Special economic zones, they'll create an area of the country where maybe they put in a bunch of infrastructure, or maybe they give better tax rates. They do things to try to encourage companies to go there, and the hope is that that will spur the rest of the economy. I would say often it does, but it's still slow to happen in quite a few countries. Special economic zones I just talked about. Export processing zones, somewhat similar, but a lot of people feel like these don't benefit the economy as much. These are basically usually just assembly plants, right? And it's like, well, if you have an assembly plant, let's say in Mexico near the border, where they assemble a product that then goes to the US, well, because they're just assembling, they're not getting expertise in the making of these different products, which is what a lot of countries want to do. They want to be able to figure out how to do it so they can do it for themselves. In general, countries that have focused just on export processing zones, they have not done as well, we'll put it that way. Free trade zones, these are again things that a lot of developing countries especially do in order to try to get people to move their manufacturing or other industry. But like I said, this is as manufacturing is changing and it's being even more automated in the rise of artificial intelligence. These types of techniques may be declining in their importance going forward. There's also a big shift toward sustainability. That is kind of a big area going forward because, well, a number of countries they'll have a special economic zone, and they'll attempt to lure in business, and they'll not have any regulations because the hope is that although maybe you're a polluting industry, you'll still bring jobs and expertise to an area. In general, these have turned out to be pretty short-sighted, and very often a company will come in and let's say that they're just there to extract a resource. Well, they may just extract the resource and then not especially benefit the local economy, and then just use up that resource and leave, right? These types of things, well, they're not sustainable. They don't help your economy in a long term. Often you can have a place that is worse off afterward, right? If you have a company come in and they have some jobs for a little while, but they have a lot of pollution, maybe they even change the dynamics of where people live because they've located in a town, and so people have moved there and they've developed a bit of a shanty town, and then they don't have the money for basic social services to kind of keep it clean and to educate people. You could have a worse situation than you had before, right? Countries, especially developing ones, more and more worried about being exploited. Like I said, this chapter talks a lot about sustainability. There's 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are established by the UN. These genuinely, when the UN creates these goals, it often just doesn't make them, and they do this, I think, every 15 years or so. They kind of create more goals, and what it means is they want to, with what little budget they have, they want to address these different issues. Let's see, I think I have a slide that has, do I have a slide? There we go. Well, I can't cover each of these goals, but in general, I would say, well, since they're sustainable development goals, if you think of in general sustainability, and also if you think about development as providing kind of the basis for development, being basic sanitation, basic education, services to make sure that you're not having starvation, not having detrimental pollution, things like that. Let me go back a couple slides. So I would say things like, well, this chapter talks about ecotourism, which I talked a bit about that in Latin America before, but strategies like ecotourism, whereas early tourism, the businesses that invested in it and that made money on it, they often really didn't care about the local population, and they didn't care that much about even the local environment that people were going there to visit. And so you would have all kinds of problems, like you'd have a resort that would be by a nice tropical location, and the rainforest would just get filled up with garbage from it, right? It's expensive to get rid of that. And also you would, classically, they would ship in food and stuff for people to eat and consume, rather than get local products that could pay local people to produce. Things like that have changed around with tourism specifically, and similarly, countries want to do that with the rest of their economies, but it really has ups and downs. Like I mentioned before, the previous president of Brazil felt that basically most of the Amazon should be just bulldozed and turned into urban areas and suburbs and whatnot. The new president who was just elected, very different feelings, wants to give sections of the Amazon back to the indigenous populations who live there and allow them to basically maintain these different areas and to protect the rainforest, see it as a world sustainable product, right? Since it does, well, we've talked about all the reasons why the rainforest should not be cut down in general. Ecotourism. Well, not only does it mean not polluting and not destroying the environments that people are going to visit, but also tourism that financially compensates local people rather than just kind of rich resort owners, right? We've been through a lot of these points before, so I'm not going to jump on them too much, other than saying there is in general a worry that, that some amount of tourism isn't really that sustainable or eco-friendly, and increasingly ecotourism is used as kind of a sales label. So people need to kind of research if they want to go and do something that's sustainable. In general, tourism around the world, although of course it took a big dive in 2020, from what I've read, a lot of it has come back, and there's predictions that in the future the tourist industry will be one of the kind of big growth poles in the world. Just a little map showing basically tourism mixed with biodiversity hotspots and coral reef hotspots. These are brought up because these are areas that are basically vulnerable to overuse if you have too many tourists go to one place, for example. I'm not going to do this case study. This chapter talks about specifically the lithium mining and new products and materials that are basically going to be some of the future main resources. Also talks about how, well, okay, I said this already, a lot of things that are manufactured are not manufactured with products from one country. Increasingly, these are internationally made. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of countries, well, they used to give tax breaks for different industry in the hope that they would locate there, in the hope that they would do things. But these days it's difficult to do that because you'll just have parts of something that are made in your country, and the other parts will be specialized in other countries. And this is a map looking at more current data as far as what countries are kind of stuck in the different levels of development, right? So depending on exports of agricultural products, right, these countries would really like to have an amount of industry, have amount of different areas of their economy, and they do have some, but they feel like they're often a bit stuck in these kind of lower levels. Even countries that are dependent on energy exports, sure, a number of these countries are quite wealthy, but there's a bit of an eye toward the future and alternative sources of energy, and what that will do to these countries if they don't diversify their economies, right? Some of the richer ones are attempting to diversify their economy, do different things, but I would say in general it's going slowly because they don't have to, right? It's like, well, right now, making plenty of money out of oil exports. So we'll see about that. Depending on the exports of minerals, ores, and metals, again, the mining industry and a person who's working in the mine worldwide tends not to make a lot of money, and so if your economy kind of is stuck doing that, hasn't been able to diversify into other areas, they could feel like they're a country that will never kind of have a middle class. The half of the countries in this scenario, non-commodity dependent. What that means is those are countries that are much more flexible. Those are countries that, well, to use an example, let's say you have a specific ore that you're using, and perhaps scientists figure out a replacement. I would say a classic example a lot of people don't know about is nitrogen. Right? Nitrogen, which is used for things as diverse as fertilizers to explosives. Well, there used to be big nitrogen mines and boom towns in Latin America, specifically in Chile, but somewhat some other areas. But as I'm sure most of you know, most of the air we breathe is nitrogen, right? So there's nitrogen everywhere. And so a number of scientists at a certain point just kind of determined, well, why don't we just figure out a way how to get it out of the air, and then everyone could have nitrogen wherever you are, rather than having to pay to mine it. And well, they did invent that, and they were successful, but the second they did that, this economy totally collapsed, right? All of these economies that are dependent on any one area, they're all very vulnerable to, if that one resource, if it has a tumble in the market, your whole economy goes down. Similar to when I talk about deindustrialization and how the Twin Cities had a more kind of diverse economy, so when one area got hit, there were other areas that kind of softened the blow. That's another reason why these countries kind of don't want to be stuck in these dependencies. don't want to talk about that. All right, y'all. I got some questions for you to answer. And